IO9 presents The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And here are your hosts, John Joseph Adams and David Barr Kirtley.
Hello, and welcome to episode 50 of Geek's Guide to the Galaxy.
Hi, this is John Joseph Adams. I'm the editor of Lightspeed magazine, and I also recently took over as publisher. The first year of Lightspeed's fiction is now available in print form in the anthology Lightspeed Year 1. My next books to come out are Under the Moons of Mars in February and Armored in April.
And I'm David Barr Kirtley. I'm the author of many short stories, including Veil of Ignorance, about a group of friends who experiment with a mind-bending alien drug. The story originally appeared in the anthology All the Rage this year, and also in episode 1 of the Mech Muse podcast. And our guest today is Chuck Palahniuk. He's the author of novels such as Haunted, Rant, Snuff, and Tell All. His novels Fight Club and Choke were both adapted for film. His work is often shocking, and almost 70 people are reported to have fainted while listening to him read his short story Guts. His latest novel, Damned, is about a teenage girl who dies and goes to hell.
All right, so let's get to our interview.
All right, so we're here with Chuck Palahniuk. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so at your public appearances, you ask trivia questions and throw inflatable toys into the crowd. How did you first get that idea, and when did you first start doing it?
You know, and every event is different. Those are just a couple of different elements that I might use. But years ago, you know, maybe the third or the fourth year I was doing tours, I found myself just hating the task. And I thought that if I gave away prizes or gifts when people ask a question, I could not simultaneously be hostile and give them something. And so I started to buy these kind of big outlandish pieces of costume jewelry, usually tiaras and crowns. In every city I went to, before we did the event, we would go to a Claire's and buy all of their sort of beauty queen tiaras. And it worked. You know, no matter how tired I was or how starving I was or how much I had to take a leak, if I gave them something, that physical gesture trumped all of my internal crappiness, and I ended up actually liking it and really loving the process. Usually the two hardest things in a book event are to get the questions started and then, ironically, to end the questions. But if people see that you've got 16 tiaras, then they're instantly clamoring to ask a question. And as they see the tiaras dwindle, they know that the last tiara means the last question. And so I've been able to structure that part of each book event that was just so difficult before.
Okay, so it's been reported that over 70 people have fainted while listening to you read your short story Guts. And I just listened to an interview where you said that you were working on something that makes Guts look tame by comparison. Could you tell us about that?
No way. I've got two stories that will both totally eclipse Guts in the public mind, but I'm not saying anything about them. I'm not going to spoil that thunder until the stories are ready.
So what was it like the first time you read Guts and had people start fainting?
The first time, I didn't realize that someone had fainted because the crowd was that big and it was somebody standing towards the back where there was no seating left. And I didn't realize that a young man had fainted, and he was kind of rescued by the people around him. But the time that I was most aware of it was a couple readings later in San Francisco at the old Cody's bookstore on Telegraph up by the University of California. And a couple people in the very center of this banked auditorium, right in the middle of my vision, they fainted on their neighbors. And the whole place just went nuts. And it was just terrific to watch because suddenly instead of 700 people looking at me, it was me looking at 700 people, and I was completely forgotten in the room as everyone went to rescue these two people that everyone seemed to have thought had died. And as these people came back to life, the crowd just went nuts. They were so euphoric, like they had seen Lazarus raised from the dead.
Okay, so your new novel, Damned, is sort of like The Breakfast Club Goes to Hell. Which character from The Breakfast Club were you most like in high school?
Well, Ali Sheedy. There was a really lovely woman named Glenda Hawes who moved to our school maybe in 6th grade, and her parents had a shop where they sold Western clothing in a town nearby. And so the perception was that they were wealthy people. And Glenda was very pretty, and she had a southern accent. And I had a crush on her, one of those 7th grade crushes. And one day she was taking books out of her locker, and a book fell, and it caught the string of beads that was hanging around her neck and broke the string. And as the beads fell down, I saw my chance, and I went forward and I helped her gather them all up. And as I was giving them to her, she very sweetly looked up and said, "You're a very nice person, huh? You're a very sweet, sweet person." And it surprises me because when I moved here, everyone in the school told me that y'all was retarded. And that was heartbreaking. You know, not just to hear it from her, but to find out that it was something that was being commonly told to total strangers by people who I thought were my friends.
So when you wrote Damned and sort of put yourself in the head of a kind of teenage character, did that bring back painful memories from that time in your life?
No, really, I only tell the Glenda Hawes story in relation to the story called Romance that I'm reading on tour this year. I was watching the Sean Penn movie, I Am Sam. And the premise is that Sean Penn, who is severely retarded, has a very young daughter by a woman who apparently was with him long enough to get pregnant. And that works that way in that I could conceive of a woman thinking that Sean Penn is just this very good-looking, very drunk guy and going home with him one night or one weekend and getting pregnant. But turning it around, I had to think, how good-looking would a woman have to be before a man would start to overlook fantastically aberrant behavior? And how much would he have to deceive himself in order to continue to be in love with this incredibly good-looking woman? And so that was the inspiration for Romance. Romance is metaphorically about what it's like to fall in love with an idea and to think that that idea is all that you will ever need, and you isolate yourself with the idea and you exist with nothing but that idea for weeks or for months at a time. But eventually you have to introduce that idea that you love so much. You have to introduce it to your friends and your family. And at that point, depending on whether or not they see the same value in the idea, you're confronted by either having to betray your friends and family or betray your inspiration, the thing that you loved so much.
Okay, and then how did you go about constructing your vision of hell, and what kind of research did you do?
Leonard's character is the one that knows all about demonology, that kind of cross-cultural theology based on demons and what each culture considers evil, what they blame disasters on. And so just reading all the books about demonology was the most research I did. Oh, also research on Halloween. I fell in love with Halloween when I found out that it used to be just a night of fantastic property damage. That Halloween really was a night when in small cities and towns, all slights, all injustices were avenged. And it was a night that you went and you killed your neighbor's dog, or you set their barn on fire, or you knocked their fence down, or you cut their tires. And it wasn't until the 1920s that city governments started to conspire with major newspapers and with candy makers. And they started to organize media campaigns where they would offer troublemakers candy in exchange for not burning down the town every Halloween. And so what we think of as Halloween is really the product of media barons, city mayors, and candy makers. Before the 1920s, Halloween was really a terrible, terrible night.
I heard you read a short story called Cold Calling that's about a telemarketer, and telemarketing also features prominently in Damned. Could you say, what is it about telemarketing that makes it a subject that you are interested in writing about?
The original Cold Calling story was from 5 or 6 years ago, and it was never published. I sold the rights to that to Nickelodeon so I don't hold those rights anymore. But I like the almost accidental way in which people are connected by a machine. More applicable to Damned was that I wrote the book while I was taking care of my mother who was dying, and telemarketing calls were some of the only breaks in my day, the only times when I had kind of contact with the outside world. And so when a telemarketer would call, I would find myself trying to keep them on the line longer than they wanted to talk. So it was a kind of ironic turnabout.
Okay, so I need to jump in here, and you sold rights to a story to Nickelodeon. I'm having a hard time imagining how Nickelodeon would be involved with Chuck Palahniuk. Can you explain that?
Oh, over the years, there's been several different sort of floated television projects that I've been brought on board to help with. And one was an idea for Nickelodeon that I was brought on board to help develop. And I proposed this telemarketing angle, and they liked it, so they bought the original story. You know, it was actually a very clean little story, just this very innocent back and forth between a kid and another kid as they gradually lied to each other more and more. It was a very clean story that way.
So, you know, since we're a science fiction and fantasy podcast primarily, are you actually a science fiction fan yourself? And if so, who are some of your favorite authors?
I am going back very much an old school Ray Bradbury kind of guy and Stephen King kind of guy. And again, mostly short stories. Anything from Martian Chronicles I really loved. And I still remember the first time I read Night Shift. I was really blown away by it.
So in 2008, you taught at the Clarion West Science Fiction Writers Workshop, and I just saw that you're going to be back again this summer. What sort of experiences did you have last time you were there?
I worked with about 20 really fantastically bright people. I think that they screen people very, very carefully to get the very best people into those programs, and that there wasn't a person there who didn't have a fantastic idea. And so what I mostly focused on was helping them write their idea as clearly as possible and develop it to something that they could bring to market.
Now, you know, you sort of started off as more of a mainstream type of author, and as you've progressed in your career, you've had more and more sort of more and more of your work has sort of blended into the genre, like horror and whatnot. And is that something that you would see yourself moving towards more, or are you just sort of going to bounce back and forth throughout genres your whole career, do you think?
You know, what I first did, the first few books, if they had to fall in kind of a genre or classification, they were what people used to call transgressive writing, where you had people doing illegal things, kind of extreme things, but for noble reasons. And that became a little unpalatable after 9/11, that we weren't accepting transgressive acts as sympathetically anymore. And so I think that's when the idea of going to a genre like horror or science fiction seemed like a much more effective avenue for doing social commentary. And it won't always be that case, you know, the farther we get from 9/11. But I think it's still the case right now.
So when you're teaching at a workshop like that, do you pass along the lessons that you learned from Tom Spanbauer, or do you have a different approach that you take?
I pass along what I learned from every writer that I wish I'd known when I was younger. You know, lessons from Tom Spanbauer and from writers like Peter Christopher, every writer that I have met and interacted with, David Sedaris, Neil Gaiman, Clive Barker. If they taught me something that was really effective, it's something I want to pass on to people, especially if they're younger people who might not learn these things for years.
Could you think about, just off the top of your head, what any of those lessons were? Could you put that into words?
No abstract measurements. You know, when someone walks in and you say a 6-foot-tall man, you've missed the opportunity to describe what a 6-foot-tall man would be for your narrator. Because how the narrator describes a 6-foot-tall man says more about the narrator than about the man. And so every time you use an abstract, you're using a shortcut that is cheating you out of some really fantastic opportunity.
I mean, could you talk about the Tom Spanbauer workshop that you were in and sort of how you got involved with that?
in my early 30s, when I wanted to be a writer, I joined a workshop that was all very nice ladies, more or less writing kind of child in peril thrillers. They all wanted to be published, writing these stories about children being murdered or kidnapped, but all in peril. And my stories were so upsetting to them. My stories were just too confronting. They had too much violence and too much sexuality in them. Nothing was really hidden off screen, and that was just too much for them. They would leave almost in tears sometimes.
Well, like I heard you tell one thing about this blow-up doll that's deflating.
That was the straw that broke the camel's back. Was the blow-up doll scene that I later used in Snuff, where the kid is trying to fornicate with this doll that he has dressed up to look like his ideal, and he realizes the doll has a slow leak, and so it becomes this race to fulfill his needs before the doll is completely this flat, wrinkled thing. And that was the scene that got me kicked out of workshop.
And did they say like we don't feel safe with you here or something like that?
They always say there are members of the group who no longer feel comfortable having you in the workshop. But as a kind of consolation, they suggested that a man had just moved from New York to Portland, and his name was Tom Spanbauer, and he was teaching the style called minimalism that he had learned at Columbia from a famous teacher, famous editor named Gordon Lish, who was Raymond Carver's editor. And they put me in touch with Tom, and I was one of Tom's first 4 students, and that was in 1990, August of 1990, and that's when I really started to write.
So your novel Damned, it features this really devastating satire of these do-gooder movie stars, Madison's parents. Is that all in good fun, or are you genuinely appalled by people like that?
I'm kind of more or less appalled by people who preach kind of ecological awareness, but that their lifestyles, consume so much resources. When we were in Sundance, in Park City, Utah, for the launch of the Choke movie, I was always struck by the hundreds and hundreds of Lincoln Navigators that were lined up everywhere and constantly running so that they would be warm when their celebrities came out of whatever the venue was. And all of these Lincoln Navigators burning all this gas, lined up for miles, all had no blood for oil bumper stickers. And it was just such a shocking, horrible hypocrisy. Part of the inspiration for my book, Tell All, is that every really beautiful, fantastically groomed actress had a kind of dowdy, dumpy, very plain assistant or team of assistants who would sort of act as this kind of remote support and always travel a few, a dozen feet behind this beautiful object that they maintained. And that at any moment when the object was disturbed, this team would rush forward and intensely groom it, restore it to its perfection. And then they would immediately remove themselves from its vicinity so that they would never be photographed with it. And that was just amazing to watch.
How did you feel about the film adaptations of Fight Club and Choke changing the endings of the books?
I didn't mind. That's part of the bargain, is that if they're going to put that much money and energy and time into the story, I think they should have some freedom to adapt the story. But I thought it was interesting that they both cut out the kind of third act scene in which the hero is completely humiliated and subjugated before his peer group. And I have to wonder if there's some aspect of movie-making culture that can't allow itself to experience that kind of public humiliation.
So in Fight Club, I know there's an interesting story you sort of tell on the director commentary where where Marla utters her famous line about.
If I remember right, when I wrote it, my first thought was, when Tyler and Marla wake up together, what is the most romantic thing that Marla could say, the most sentimental thing? And that would be, I want to have your baby. And so being Marla, she had to say the opposite. So it was just by formula that she had to say, I want to have your abortion. And so that's what went into the book. But everyone hated that line. Even Brad Pitt, came to the producers and said, my mother is going to see this movie, and my mother is going to be so offended by that line. So everyone wanted to change it, and they floated a lot of different versions. And I think Fincher finally came up with, I haven't been fucked like that since grade school. And when he shot it that way, Laura Ziskin, the producer, went nuts and said, change it back for the love of God. And Fincher was so thrilled that he had come up with something worse that's what he went with.
And then Brad Pitt's mom, she was okay with that one?
I have no idea. I think by that point, it had been such a drawn-out process that it was kind of a line in the sand. This is what we're going to go with. We got rid of the thing that you hated. You got something you hated more, so just be careful about what you complain about in the future.
Actually, I heard you read this story about this boy who grows up with a dad always telling these jokes, these sort of bad...
the knock-knock, yeah.
Where did you get all those jokes? I mean, was there like a book of bad jokes you used, or had you heard them, or...?
I think I learned all those jokes in second grade. Second grade is really where they tell you those horrific jokes, racist jokes and misogynistic jokes that you have no idea what they mean. And you just memorize them because you know they have a very strong effect, that they make people laugh in this kind of nervous, horrible way. And it's only later that you realize that you've got a head full of crap at that point.
So at your recent appearances that I've seen, you sort of start things off with this anecdote about an oncologist. Could you talk about that?
Earlier this summer, I was at a charity dinner, and I was seated across the table from an oncologist, a cancer specialist. He was telling this funny story, what he considered a funny story about sitting on an airplane drinking a glass of wine. And the woman next to him starts talking to him, and she's saying how much she loves wine and she would love to have a glass of wine. And she used to drink a glass of wine every night until recently. Every time she started to drink wine, she would feel this fantastic sharp pain in the base of her throat. And so she had decided, she's explaining to this doctor, that God doesn't want her to drink wine anymore because she feels this pain anytime she drinks wine or beer or any kind of alcohol. And so this doctor drinking his wine, sitting next to her on the plane, says, ma'am, that's not God. That's what they call a canary indicator, like a canary in a coal mine. And when you feel a sharp, burning pain at the base of your throat like that, anytime you drink even the smallest amount of alcohol, that is an undeniable symptom that you have Hodgkin's lymphoma. And he gave her his card and said, give your doctor my card and have him call me, because I think you have stage 4 Hodgkin's, and you'll probably die very soon. And he said the woman on the plane suddenly wasn't as chatty. She got so quiet. And that within a few days, this woman's doctor called him and said, you were right. You hit the nail right on the head. She has Hodgkin's. And you could have been a little less of a prick about telling her.
So was that a thing where he told that story and instantly you were like, oh yeah, I'm using that on the book tour?
I knew I would use it because it was such an extraordinary, sad, funny little story, but I wasn't sure exactly what the metaphor demonstrated. And then I saw how I could use it to illustrate the metaphor that I like to talk about with stories. A good story should change the way you see the world. After you hear even the shortest great story, it should change the way, it should fill you with a little bit of fear. Because now, whenever I drink, and from now on, whenever you drink, you will wait for that little pain. Every sip of alcohol, you'll think, am I going to die? Do I have Hodgkin's? And when you don't feel that pain, the combination of the fear and the alcohol will make you feel better than you ever felt before. And that's how a good story works, is it changes how you feel, but it brings you to a greater appreciation or a greater joy of existence.
All right, so that basically does it for our questions. Are there any other newer upcoming projects that you're working on? Anything you want to mention?
Working on the next 2 books that come after Damned. So it's going to be 3 books ultimately. And that's really it, working on the 2 stories that will make people forget guts.
Do you have any idea how soon those 2 stories will be revealed?
It's not going to happen. They're definitely tour stories. That something that Tom really taught us was reading our work out loud. And so every week in a workshop, whatever you brought, whether it was a scene or a story or a chapter, you had to read it out loud to people so that you would get the spontaneous feedback of laughter or shock. You would get that completely uncensored feedback of an audience. And so every time I have to tour, I write a story specifically for reading out loud. And that's what Guts started as. And so these stories really won't exist until the next tour, because that's when I'll need something to read out loud.
And the next tour will be
2013, if I can help it.
All right, great. Well, Chuck Palahniuk, thanks so much for joining us on Geek's Guide to the Galaxy. And,
not at all. Okay.
Yep, and good luck with Clarion West this summer, this coming summer.
Oh, yeah. It'll be fun.
All right, nice talking to you.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
And that was our interview. So thanks so much to Chuck Palahniuk for joining us on the show. All right, for our discussion today, we're going to be talking about Satan. And we're joined by a special guest geek today, Grady Hendrix. He's one of the founders of the New York Asian Film Festival, which got him profiled by The New Yorker, who noted, quote, "Grady Hendrix doesn't seem like the kind of guy who would enjoy watching a man bite through his arm while masturbating inside a burlap sack, but he is." For years, he was a regular film critic for the New York Sun. He's also written for Slate, The Village Voice, Time Out New York, Playboy, and Variety. His first novel, Satan Loves You, is out now. So, Grady, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right, and so I think we're going to start out just talking about sort of early recollections of Satan, because I can still remember the first time I ever heard the name Satan.
Which was when?
This is...
Yeah, I would actually be really interested to hear that from you, since you grew up without any religious upbringing at all. So it must have been a quite different experience for you.
Yeah, like you're saying, my parents are not religious, so, we never went to church or anything. And so for my birthday one year, my parents bought me Ghosts and Goblins for the Nintendo Entertainment System. And then we went down to this pizza place and, with some friends. And I was really excited. And I was reading the story, quote unquote story out of the, instructions manual. And of course, the villain in that game is Satan. And so I'm reading the story to my friends. I'm like, isn't this cool? And I said, and then they're like, you're going to have to go and fight Satan. And my friend Joe's like, it's not pronounced Satan, dumbass. It's pronounced Satan. So I still remember that. It's like, I don't know. And I still think it should be pronounced Satan. I mean, that's how it's spelled. But I mean, I don't know. What were you guys' experience? I mean, because John, you were raised Catholic, right?
Yeah, I actually went to Catholic school. And I don't really remember like growing up worrying about the devil or anything. I mean, I sort of remember like worrying about hell when I was a kid, because you're sort of indoctrinated to believe that if you do bad things that you're going to go to hell, and I mean, obviously I was a little kid, but still, I mean, I would see things and I would worry about like, well, is this a bad enough thing to go to hell for, or what happens if I do something by mistake and then I don't want to go to hell,
All right, so Grady, how about you? What's your story?
Well, I grew up in South Carolina in a really religious home. I mean, a sort of by rote religious home, church and Sunday school every week and all that. So I grew up sort of immersed in all this stuff. But like John, I never, ever, like Satan was never the big bad, and in fact, hell always seemed, I mean, when you're a kid, it seems more like a challenge than anything. I mean, like a prison escape movie. If I go to hell, I can probably get out of it somehow, some way that someone in the last thousands of years of human civilization hasn't thought of. I will, of course, because I'm awesome. So it seemed more exciting and interesting than anything. And, I was even growing up as a kid during the whole satanic panic thing. And, when it was like every other daycare center was secretly a front for an underground cable of devil worshippers who were like eating babies. And even that, I mean, we all sort of knew that was BS. It just seemed sort of interesting and intriguing and certainly not threatening or scary.
Yeah, man. I mean, I don't know what they told me when I was a kid, but man, hell sure seems scary. I mean, like, I guess that's the reason why they say scary as hell is the phrase, but I mean, like, seriously, like, I would freak out about it. I would think about, like, well, it's like forever. It's like you're in hell forever, and it's hot. It's really, really hot. I don't think I can stand that heat, and it's like, it's just like, it's something that, like, how do you tell that to a child? I don't understand. It seems like cruel and unusual punishment.
How meaningful is that after billions of years of it? Like,
well, yeah.
If you're roasting in fire for a billion years, is it still like, don't you just kind of get used to it after a while? Or, I mean, what context is there? I mean,
well, it's funny. Like, to me, it's like the worst punishment someone could have in hell is you're randomly selected for a random amount of time to sit in a chair, and half of you are randomly selected to get pina coladas, and the other half are randomly selected to get, like, burnt alive. And the people getting burnt alive have to look at the people having pina coladas just to remind them that they could be having the pina colada and not getting, like, third-degree burns on their balls.
Well, I heard this thing that actually the idea of hell as this fiery place comes from, there was this place, Gehenna, outside Jerusalem. It was sort of like a garbage dump, and it was always on fire. And, if when you died, nobody cared enough to give you a good burial, they would just dump your body in this flaming garbage dump. And that kind of, people sort of in later time sort of misunderstood that, and sort of the idea of hell as this otherworldly place came out of that. Well, let's talk about appearances of Satan in the Bible. You've got the serpent in the Garden of Eden. There's this really good podcast I listen to called The Bible Geek, and a lot of what I'll say about this is just stuff I heard on that podcast. But he was saying that at the time that story kind of got put together, the Garden of Eden story, that Yahweh worship was competing against serpent worship, and that, like, lots of people were just worshiping serpents. And so the story was just kind of put together because, the moral of the story is like, hey, don't listen to those serpents. They're fucking liars. If you listening to talking snakes is what got us into this mess in the first place.
There used to be the idea that there was an adversary, but it wasn't a literalized adversary. And like you're saying, that was later sort of like, hey, that serpent sucked. Let's make him this devil guy also.
Well, right. And like another one I was going to mention is Job, right, where my understanding is that originally the quote-unquote adversary was not the adversary of God, but he was the adversary of those who would defy God. And he was sort of like God's prosecuting attorney or something. And so in that story, that makes a lot more sense to me that, God and his right-hand man, as it were, are making bets about how humans will behave, rather than like God and the devil hanging out making bets. That's a little weird.
Which is, it's like the weirdest buddy movie ever made.
There's this verse in Ephesians where Satan is referred to as the prince of the power of the air. And what the Bible Geek said is that actually, apparently there's actually nothing in the Bible that suggests that the devil is in hell or rules over hell, the underworld or anything like that. And that actually that this prince of the power of the air thing suggests an earlier version of the story in which, Satan kind of ruled the lower heavens. He'd sort of been kicked out of the upper heavens, and so he had no place to go except kind of the crummy, the lower heavens, regions of the sky. And
those have terrible public schools. It's awful. Maybe there's more in New Testament, I think, because that's when we start getting more demons and stuff. But still, I think it's still pretty not consistent.
Okay, well, actually, I wanted to mention, speaking of the New Testament, the story of the Gerasene demoniac, which I just think is funny. If you don't know the story, basically, there's this guy who's possessed by demons, and Jesus shows up and convinces, or sort of causes the demons to leave this guy's body and go into some pigs, who then go and drown themselves in a river. Apparently 2,000 pigs. And I just think this is an extremely strange story.
Also, who has 2,000 pigs? like they just totally wiped out the pig wealth of like one of the richest pig men in all of like Judea.
It does suggest a pretty high sort of exchange rate for demon, sort of human to pig demon possession. I mean, if you, you just gotta, if you're planning to exorcise a guy and, put his demons into pigs, you're going to need a lot of pigs.
But also, I think Revelations, we wind up getting, more of Judgment Day stuff, which is where a lot of the devil stuff comes from, which is, the end times, the Judgment Day, when, technically speaking, everyone's just supposed to lay the fuck down in their graves and wait for Judgment Day, at which point they will be judged and either go to hell or heaven. So, technically speaking, hell is like completely 100% closed right now, empty, totally empty, as is heaven.
All right, but so, I think a lot of our, image of hell is formed more by Dante's Inferno than by really anything in the Bible. So why don't we talk a little bit about that?
Notice that the Inferno is assigned in high school. Who assigns Purgatorio or Paradiso? The other two major works by Dante. The dude labored for decades on this stuff, and we only read a third of it? Like, what are we, assholes? It's really interesting that, we only read the one about hell.
Because the other ones are really boring.
But the devil,
in hell, they make you read Paradiso.
That's the secret 10th circle for VIPs. But also in the Inferno, it's a really interesting version of hell. It's a little like Occupy Wall Street. Like, there's no leader. There's a hierarchy and things happen, but there's really no leader. And in fact, Satan is just a giant dumb monster down at the bottom chewing on Judas Iscariot. Like, he's not actually in charge.
Yeah, he's sort of imprisoned. He's like trapped in ice and he can't get out.
Yeah, up to his waist so you don't see his giant satanic wang. Convenient.
But it's weird that, we have this whole sort of pop mythology of the devil out in the world talking people out of their souls and stuff when Dante has him imprisoned and unable to leave hell.
Well, yeah, exactly. This idea, it's really interesting, this idea of the devil as a tempter. There are the two parts in the Bible. I guess Job, and later when Jesus is in the desert and the devil's trying to tempt him. That probably all stems from there. But it's really interesting when you think about it, because, like, what does he care? Like, what does he want to do with these souls? He gets 5 billion and he can redeem them for a Big Mac. Like he can't win. Like, you know what I mean? Like in Christian theology, unless you get in some weird dualistic kind of thing, he can't win. He can't fight God. He is a creation of. So what's he doing here? Like, who's keeping score? I got more souls than you. It's a really, once you start thinking it out, it all becomes rather pointless.
Well, there's actually somebody asked the Bible Geek one time, why is the devil going to fight at the Battle of Armageddon if he knows he's going to lose, right? Right. And the answer I thought was really interesting. He's like, well, I have two answers. The first one is that it's just in his nature, like this, and he mentioned, this, Aesop, I think it's Aesop's fable about the fox and the scorpion crossing the river. Yes. So basically, like this scorpion comes along and says to the fox, hey, I want to get across this river. Could you give me a ride? And if you do, I'll tell you where there's some awesome fox chow on the other side. And the fox says, hey, man, you're a scorpion. I'm not going to, and scorpions, sting people, and I'm not going to let you ride on me. And the scorpion says, hey, if I were to sting you as we're swimming across the river, we would both drown and I would die. So obviously I'm not going to do that. And the fox is like, yeah, that's a good point. All right, I'll give you a ride. And so as they're swimming across the river, the scorpion stings the fox. And the fox is like, dude, WTF, we're going to die now. And the scorpion's like, hey, I'm the scorpion. I sting people. That's what I do. And so, that the devil might be kind of like that, it's in his nature to fight.
Unable to control his instinct to be a little devil.
But then the other thing is he was talking about in some comic book, they go to hell and there's like a different version of the Bible in hell. And in that version, it says that the devil's going to win, the Battle of Armageddon. Well, yeah, each side has its version of the story,
right,
saying that it's going to win. But yeah, but let's talk about Paradise Lost too. Yeah, I think especially, it's really hard for me to see, to not see the story in terms of sort of like Lucifer is the underdog and the forces of heaven are like the cool kids who kicked him out, who like ostracized him or whatever. And I think even in Milton, it's been a long time since I've read it, but I think Lucifer says a lot of sort of democratic-sounding rhetoric about, why we shouldn't be ruled over by a tyrant, a sort of monarchical tyrant. And it's actually fun. You go back a couple hundred years and read a lot of literature that just assumes that democracy is bad, and any character who mouths democratic ideals is just self-evidently misguided.
Well, it's also, one of the things I think, though, the reason that happens is, just on a narrative level, Satan's more interesting. You know what I mean? Like, he goes from state A, being an angel, to state B, being, screwing up and being in hell, to state C, eternal warfare against heaven to try to sort of regain his place or, subvert mankind. Whereas God existed state A, complete perfection all the way through. But I also think that Milton lived, and I'm not sure if he died when Oliver Cromwell was still ruling England or he lived through Cromwell's reign. But, that was this sort of anti-hierarchical, anti-monarchy, anti-royalist revolution. It was hideous. I mean, people were dyed and mutilated, had their ears cut off and their faces mangled and all these things because they went against the natural order of having a hierarchical king who was appointed by God. It's like God's the boss and the king is his manager, and we are, then there are the upper level management, and then there's us. So, I think Satan comes across as so compelling because we're looking at him from a point of view now where it's like, well, that's interesting rather than abhorrent.
Awesome. All right. So why don't we talk about some of the sort of more modern books and movies and stuff? I mean, I think two of the most highly regarded horror movies of all time are The Exorcist and Rosemary's Baby. I have to say, I don't honestly find them that scary.
Really?
I kind of, maybe it's just because I wasn't raised with this stuff, but I actually found The Exorcist kind of funny. I mean, anytime you've got a little girl tied to a bed, projectile vomiting on a priest, I mean, that's just comedy gold as far as I'm concerned. But I don't know. What do you guys think of those movies?
I mean, I saw them at an early impressionable age and they freak me out. And they also give me like my favorite Satan is, I don't know if you know, Jack Chick, like Chick comic books,
Yeah.
The little Christian tracks where it's like, someone does good deeds all their life and they die. And it's like, oh no, I'm burning in hell. Why? Oh, because I'm Hindu. And then there's like Satan on the side going, ha ha. Like, I like the Satan who's just a jerk and screws with people. And that's sort of what you get from that's the Satan of Rosemary's Baby and The Exorcist. Like, I'm going to go to Earth and possess a 14-year-old girl and puke on a priest just because I'm a dick. Or hey, I want to go get laid and Mia Farrow's very cute and
I really think that stuff that involves sort of Judeo-Christian ideas, I have a hard time accepting just because the influence of those religions in politics sort of has irritated me so much. It just sort of reminds me of how frustrating some of those conversations are. Whereas with Lovecraft or something, I don't have that same thing. But if there were people who thought that Lovecraft was all literally true and they were constantly trying to use the government to shove it down my throat, I would have a much harder time enjoying Lovecraftian horror stories. You know what I mean? If the devil came to you and wanted to make a deal for your soul, why would you ever do it? I mean, that would just prove that, because the reason that that your soul would be in jeopardy in the main would be that you don't think God is real or that you're an adherent of some other religion, right?
Yeah.
But if the devil comes to you with this contract or whatever, then you would immediately...
Why on earth, if the devil appeared, why would that not resolve all your doubts instantly?
Yeah, well, it seems like if I were the devil, say, I wouldn't be going around trying to get people to sign contracts for their souls. I would be going around promoting science education and encouraging people to study the Bible, because those seem to be the two things in my experience that have made most of my friends atheists, right?
Yeah.
One of my favorite actually depictions of Lucifer was in Neil Gaiman's Sandman, where he's this sort of really beautiful blonde man, sort of radiant, and that's always struck me as much more insightful than if he's this horrible horned monster, because it seems like for evil to have any sort of hold over you, it has to be at least superficially attractive. Just like if this horrible monster came to you, and wanted you to join him or whatever, you'd be like, no, I'm freaked out by your giant teeth and stuff. But if it's like a really good-looking person, yeah, I mean that's sort of a perfect metaphor for evil to me. It's sort of like a really attractive person who, at first glance is pretty, but the more you sort of think about it, the more you learn about them, the more uneasy you become.
That Neil Gaiman hell is the one where you're only there if you think you should be there and be punished in the first place, which is problematic because that means you only go to hell if you feel guilty about what you've done. So what about sociopaths in Neil Gaiman's sort of theology? They go to heaven because they have no sense of personal guilt.
My family does a lot of backpacking, and so we would always backpack around all these places, and there are always rock formations and things called Devil's Tower, Devil's Bathtub, Devil's Frying Pan, all this stuff that I always thought was really thought was really cool. But then it turns out that those are all the places that there were like sacred sites for the American Indians. And then then the settlers came and were like, that's now, that used to be Holy Mountain, whatever. Now it's Devil's Mountain. And that's kind of a dick move. I mean, did you guys have like examples from contemporary entertainment of demons, devils, hell, stuff like that you wanted to mention?
Actually, one of my favorite ones is I seem to be in the minority on this, but there's this movie called Tales from the Crypt, Demon Knight. It's like, Tales from the Crypt was this series on HBO, and it was, short. It was an anthology series, so it was like different short stories, like week to week, different stories every week. And then it ended its run, and then they made a movie, and so there's a demon knight who's like a good guy who's he's sort of charged with fighting the demons, and the demons are all trying to get these keys that like unlock that would allow like the devil to escape hell or something, and so it's like tied into, it goes all the way back to Jesus. It's like they have this key, and there's like 7 keys, and the demons have collected all the other keys, and there's this last one, and so there's this like final battle, like, and that's what the movie's about. Honestly, when I think of like the devil, like almost the first thing that comes to mind is the devil from the South Park movie.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Which I actually thought was fantastic. The part he sings this song, it's like the Little Mermaid song about, if I could just live up where the people are. I mean, he's a very, very sort of sympathetic, memorable character. In terms of like books, I came up with the Screwtape Letters by C.S. Lewis.
The interesting thing about Screwtape Letters is that it's not Satan, it's just 2 demons, which I kind of like because they're like middle-level managers, writing back and forth. And actually what's really interesting is, do you guys know Focus on the Family, the sort of very right-wing conservative Christian group? So they have done, it's been around for a couple of years, but an audio drama of the Screwtape Letters. Because, C.S. Lewis, big Christian thinker. And so Focus on the Family did it. And the guy who reads the entire thing is Andy Serkis from Planet of the Apes and Gollum in Lord of the Rings.
Tim Pratt recently did an anthology called Sympathy for the Devil. And it's just, it's sort of a book collecting, a bunch of short stories all on the all that feature the devil. And so when I was thinking about this, mostly what came to mind were some of the individual short stories in this book. Like, Elizabeth Bear has one called "And the Deep Blue Sea," and that's actually in my anthology Wastelands as well, because it's sort of like in this post-apocalyptic setting. This bike messenger sort of encounters the devil out in the desert. There's just one other one that I would mention. I would call out. Elizabeth Glover has this one called Metaphysics, which I think is really interesting because it sort of it pits a rational person against the devil. And so I think it's very interesting, especially given, this sort of general Geek's Guide philosophy of religion and whatnot, that I think it would appeal to a lot of our listeners if we haven't turned you off by all of our blasphemy already. So,
let's see, Stephen King's Needful Things was another one I came up with.
Which is like my least favorite version of the devil. Like, the sneaky guy who comes in and tricks people into being horrible. It's like, to me, that version of the devil really has no resonance. He doesn't have any grandeur, any scope. Like, really, the devil's going to be spending time in some crap town in New England? For real?
But I mean, the thing about Needful Things that does work for me is that evil is inculcated through the manipulation of people's materialism, their consumerism. Actually, and speaking of Stephen King, that reminds me, Stephen King's son, Joe Hill, has his most recent novel was called Horns.
Oh, Horns, yeah. I mean, not to jump back a few hundred years, but when you read old witch trial stuff, there was always this, I mean, witch trials used to be, I mean, they were very legal proceedings. They were lawyers and all that stuff. I mean, they weren't just like Monty Python, like people rounding someone up and torturing them to death. But there was always this really, really big deal that was done of, was this witch having traffic with Satan? Or was she having traffic with some other demon? And if what she was having traffic with said it was Satan, well, demons lie. So it could be a demon pretending to be Satan. And, okay, witch, we are going to torture you and then burn you to death. However, maybe it shouldn't be, maybe we should come up with something worse if it was Satan, and just, if it's a demon, that's kind of not as bad. And that's why one reason like the Malleus Maleficarum and Discovery of Witches and these witch hunting manuals were so useful, because they sort of answered these questions. I mean, their answer was, just kill them anyways. But it was this really, really point that theologians really sweated blood over. Like, is this actually Satan, or is it a demon, or is it someone saying there's a demon saying they're Satan, or Satan pretending to be a demon? And it really got into this bizarre legalistic hall of mirrors.
Well, I mean, I think most people probably know the King James Bible, but I think probably most people don't know that King James was obsessed with demonology. And I think he wrote, multiple volumes about it. And that just strikes me that you can have, just these thick tomes, like a whole library of thick tomes of information, all of which is completely just pulled out of someone's head, And then just the last thing on my list I haven't read this book either, but there's a book I've seen in the bookstore by Stephen Brust called Terrain in Hell.
I actually, when you mentioned that, I have never read, but I looked it up, and it is like complicated. Like, it is hardcore old school Christianity with like levels of heaven and levels of hell, and God wants to like build a new sunroom, so he needs a few extra levels of heaven. I mean, it gets really literal and kooky. I'm kind of curious to check it out.
All right, so Grady, why don't you tell us about your novel, Satan Loves You?
Oh, well, Satan Loves You, I wrote. It's basically a book about what it's like to sort of have the worst job ever, which is running hell. And it's sort of this fascination I've always had with sort of eternity, and how crummy it would be to be Satan for eternity. I mean, it's like you have a job forever. And so the book itself is sort of some sympathy for the devil. And I really tried to, when you're writing about the devil, you've got to pick a theology and stick with it. So I went with hardcore, very old school Catholic theology, where if you deviate and commit a sin, and you just go on to hell. And Hindus, hell. Jews, hell. That's where you are. And it's a hell based on Dante's Inferno. And then I just started literalizing things like, okay, well, it's hell. Well, there's circles, which means there's different floors. Well, who sweeps? And sort of taking it from there. And when you start to really literalize things this way, God gets more and more amorphous, and Satan gets more and more sympathetic. Like I kind of have a bigger space in my heart for the dude who's taking care of the poor, deeply confused, Hutu tribesmen who died in the 19th century without being baptized, and suddenly find themselves being broiled alive in an eternal lake of fire for eternity. Like, I've got more sympathy for the dude taking care of them than the dude who's like, you can go broil for eternity. So that's sort of where it comes from and what it is. And it's basically revolves around once every long period of time, heaven and hell have a professional wrestling match where the stakes are, if Satan wins, everything stays the way it is. But if God wins, they get to take over hell. And because demons are just generally better pugilists and more enthusiastic about violence, and angels are sort of more effete, the demons always win. But this is the first year when Satan's in a clinical depression, and it looks like heaven stands a chance of winning.
What kind of response have you gotten to that?
Really good, actually. I mean, I've got friends and people who've read it who are I had a couple of people who read it who are very devout Christians. And I mean, it's hard to find even the most devout Christian who's not willing to admit that, look, when you take these literal concepts too far, they do kind of get silly. And they take it, and everyone who's read it has taken it in the spirit it was intended. One person wrote me an email that said, I really worry about you, and I worry you're really courting some dark forces here, and this might, be bad for you. But I thought it was a funny book. That's balanced by like a couple of dozen emails I've received from people who claim to be, oh, I'm a Christian, or oh, I go to church. Because everyone, when you're talking about heaven and hell, everyone feels a need to drop in a little disclaimer about personal beliefs, who all said they had a lot of fun and really enjoyed it. I don't think I know anyone, and I know some pretty gruesomely conservative Christians who I really don't get along with in any way, shape, or form, in a political way or a social way. But I can't think of anyone, even them, who would find a book about how goofy the idea of a literal Satan is at all threatening to their own personal theology. If I can sort of ramble for one sec, the reason I actually wrote this book is because I really started thinking, what's the worst possible thing? Like, what would be hell? What is hell? Why does it have no power? What would actually be hell? And I realized it's a job. Like, having a job that's eternal and goes on forever is hell. Like, everyone has a job, but we all assume we're going to die at some point or retire and it will be over. And sort of that feeling of like, God, well, what's that like when it's thousands of years? And what's it like when you've got to be creative and think of new tortures? Like, thinking of new tortures for the damned is fun for the first 100 years, maybe the first around 1,000 years. You're like, I guess we'll go back to flaying again, maybe flaying and burying and boiling feces. Like where's the fun? Where's the joy? And so that's sort of what led to me writing Satan Loves You, which is just like this idea of eternity is really boring. We can't handle it. We can't wrap our heads around it. And so it's really not fair to make up monsters and demons and devils and gods and make them live in eternity. We can't do it. Why should they have to?
All right. Well, great. So I think we're going to wrap things up there. So Grady, thanks for joining us.
Oh, thanks for having me. And I'm sorry. I know I talk way too much.
So thanks everyone for listening. Thanks to Chuck Palahniuk for being on the show. If you enjoyed the show and you want to help us out, please go over to the iTunes store and type in Geek's Guide to the Galaxy in the search bar and bring up our thing and give us a review or a rating. We're up to 108 right now, so that's really good. And
And so another way you can support the show is if you go to IO9 and you leave a comment, because the more you comment, the more IO9 knows that you love us. And also you can tell a friend.
All right, so thanks everyone for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Geek's Guide to the Galaxy is a production of IO9. For this episode's show notes, to subscribe to this podcast, or for more information about the show, visit geeksguideshow.com. To learn more about your hosts, visit johnjosephadams.com or davidbarrkirtley.com. Music and voiceover produced by Slipgate 9 Entertainment. If you enjoyed this program, tell your friends. If you didn't enjoy it, tell no one. Thank you for listening.